Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to address an issue that gets a lot of discussion on the internet and among other Tolkien geeks, and that is the role that Merry played in the fight against the Witch King, and particularly the role that his sword played, because a lot of people have different opinions on the particular effect that that sword had in terms of rendering the Witch King vulnerable or that sort of thing. So I want to talk about that in light of all the information that I could come across. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's start our analysis a little bit before the Battle of the Witch King. In the novel, Gandalf and Pippin arrive in Minas Tirith, and the movie kind of skims over a lot of this, so you probably won't know it if you haven't read the novel. But there's a point at which Gandalf actually goes to Osgiliath to help Faramir and the men under his command kind of fight off the hordes of Mordor, partially because he knows that the Witch King is there leading the forces, and that's making it difficult for the men of Gondor to keep up their courage and stand in the face of the terror that he wields. And in one instance, he returns to Minas Tirith and he has a conversation with Denethor. And in that conversation, Denethor says, could it be that you've, been overmatched? And he says it in kind of a way that's meant to be taunting. But Gandalf basically replies, might be. And he basically says, if words of old be true, then not by the hand of man shall he fall, and it's hidden from the wise what his doom will be. Now, he uses man with a lowercase m, and generally speaking, when Tolkien is using the word with a lowercase, he's referring to the sex of the person involved. Whereas if he uses a capital M, it refers to the race, man as opposed to elf or dwarf, for instance. So it would seem to be that Gandalf is referring to the fact that he is male, because otherwise why would he even bring up, this prophecy? And this prophecy he's referring to is one stated by Glorfindel back in the earlier part of the Third Age, when the Witch King was the king of Angmar in the north fighting against the kingdom of Arnor, and he was in battle with one of the kings at that time, and the king wanted to pursue him after the defeat of the armies of Angmar, but Glorfindel basically said, don't chase after him. I don't think he's going to fall by the hands of man, and far off is his doom. And again, Glorfindel uses man, and the word is written lowercase. Now that's not definitive, because it could be that the whole point of leaving it lowercase is to leave it ambiguous, and there's no way to do that if you make it a capital M. So maybe it's, leaving it ambiguous on purpose, but if it's going to mean anything one way or the other, then it definitely means it's related to sex, not race. So that's kind of the start and the backdrop of where we're going. Now, in the actual battle itself, it gets interesting, because before the actual fight commences, the Witch King, of course, says, no man may hinder me, which he's not quite stating the words right. Nevertheless, he's trying to get across the same point. Eowyn, and again, this is slightly different than in the movie, but in the novel, before they even start fighting, she, in response to this, laughs, takes off her helmet, and basically reveals that she's a woman. And it says in the novel at that point that the Witch King pauses, as if hesitating. And that makes you think as well that the Witch King is now considering the import of the words, wondering, should I have to be worried about fighting a female as opposed to a non-human? So the Witch King certainly thinks that's a possibility, or at least it would seem so from the way that the story is written at this point. Then, of course, we get the actual fight itself, and Merry comes up from behind the Witch King just as he's about to finish off Eowyn, stabs him behind the knee, and Eowyn comes along after he falls forward and stabs him in the face, basically. So that's the end of the battle, but then after the battle, we get a line a few pages later where it says that no other blade, though mightier hands had wielded it, would have dealt the Witch King a wound so bitter, cleaving the undead flesh and breaking the spell that knit his unseen sinews or muscles to his will. And this is where a lot of people get kind of their theory about what the blade that Merry was wielding did. Now let me go back and talk about the blade itself so we can get a little more interesting information on that note. So as to the sword itself, Merry got this sword from Tom Bombadil after he rescued them from the Barrow Downs. Now, if you're not familiar with that episode because you've only seen the movies, go back and watch my video on the Barrow Downs. You can find it in the link in the description. And basically the point there is this blade, which actually he got 4 of them and gave each of the hobbits one of these blades. Everybody carried theirs all the way through to the end of the story, basically, except Frodo, who ended up getting Sting, of course. Merry's blade is basically the same as any of the others, and the first thing that we really learn about it is that they were forged by the descendants of Numenor, who were in the northern kingdom of Arnor, and Aragorn later says, after he recovers the blade, after Merry and Pippin get captured by the Uruk-hai, he finds their swords and recovers them and keeps them to give them to Merry and Pippin later on. And he mentions that the orcs wouldn't have taken them because they would have recognized them for what they are. Blades made by the descendants of Numenor wound about with spells for the Bane of Mordor. That's not exactly super specific. The Bane of Mordor can mean a lot of different things, but it's another one of those things that kind of gives some people a little bit of a hint that maybe there was something special about this blade. Now, there's some non-canonical material about the blade as well. In an early draft of the Fellowship of the Ring, which was then called The Return of the Shadow, before Tolkien put it in final form, Gandalf tells Frodo in Rivendell that it was the one kind of blade that the Ringwraiths feared. Now, is that more significant for our purposes because it was said, or is it more significant that it was later cut? Hard to say. I mean, because Tolkien didn't keep it, there's some implication that he rejected the idea, but not necessarily. He didn't necessarily reject all ideas that he cut out of actual writing. So, maybe that helps, maybe it doesn't. Another point, there's a book out there which I don't own, so I don't actually have access to the full thing, but it's The Lord of the Rings, A Reader's Companion, and in that there's an essay called The Hunt for the Ring, which basically says that the Witch King would have feared the blade because it would have been as deadly to him as the Morgul knife was to Frodo. And obviously that's not so deadly that it results in instant death if it cuts you, so that's at least somewhat significant perhaps. The other point that it makes is in the encounter, the Ringwraiths and the Witch King in particular would have kind of come to the conclusion that Frodo is somehow stronger than the Barrow-wights because that's the only way he could have gotten the sword, and that he was in league with the High Elves because he called on the name of Elbereth, which is one of the names for Varda, the Vala who made the stars. So there's some intimations there that the Witch King didn't really force the issue of trying to kill Frodo immediately because he was kind of worried about all these different things. And even though that doesn't make it into the actual novel, and I'm not sure when this essay was written, I'm not even 100% sure it was written by Tolkien. Like I said, I could only find the reference online and it didn't specify, but I assume Tolkien wrote the essay. At any rate, it does kind of jive a little bit with what Aragorn says after the encounter on Weathertop, which is, I can't think why the Ringwraiths don't attack again. They have, the advantage in terms of just pure, attacking power. There were 5 of them. They were all armed against, 4 hobbits and 1 Aragorn. He had a pretty good reason to wonder, why aren't they just attacking again? In the book, he kind of wonders, maybe they're just trusting the Morgul knife to do its work and eventually turn Frodo into a wraith. But, is it because of the blade? Is it because of the calling on the name of Elbereth? Is it because he's worried about the fact that Frodo seems to be stronger than the Barrow-wights because he has this blade that he couldn't have gotten any other way? Again, it's not really 100% clear, but all these different little references do contain elements that indicate the blade is in some way special. And of course, the novel does in its own way say that, no other blade, though wielded by a mightier hand, would have dealt him a wound so bitter. What does that mean exactly? It's not 100% clear. it then goes on to say that, it cleaved the undead flesh and broke the spell, knitting his, muscles to his will. But is that unique to the blade, or is it just the bitterness that's unique to the blade? The grammar could be interpreted two different ways. So that's kind of the information that we have on the blade itself. Now let's take a look at just some general ideas, and then we'll put it all together and see what we can come up with. So as an initial point, I would like to refer to the appendices. And in the appendices, it talks briefly about Eowyn, and it mentions in a note her encounter with the Witch King. It says she's called the Maiden of the Shield Arm because her arm was broken in her fight with the Witch King, but that the Witch King was brought to naught, and in that people saw the fulfillment of the prophecy spoken by Glorfindel, and people also saw that this was connected to Merry because he also is not a man, capital M, because he helped her in the actual defeat of the Witch King. Now again, the way the note is written, it's just ambiguous enough that you don't really know exactly how he's intending to make it, because is it she fulfilled the prophecy but Merry also helped and that was like kind of a double fulfillment, or is it, Eowyn played a role in it but Merry was really the real deal? It leaves it just ambiguous enough that you could take it either way. However, I do think that there's a few other general considerations that kind of help us out in terms of deciding what this is. Before I get to that, though, I do want to point out there is a video out there on the Hello Future Me channel, and the author of that video says this.
Even if the Witch King is to be defeated by Merry and Eowyn, normal weapons don't harm ring wraiths. Gandalf says of those who take the great rings of power, like the ring wraiths, that he does not die, but he does not grow or obtain more life. He merely continues, until at last every minute is a weariness. And if he often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades. He becomes in the end invisible permanently. With excessive use of the rings that Sauron gave them, they became part of the unseen world, making them largely immune to normal weapons. Normal weapons might pass through them, not damage them, or just shatter when they hit them.
Now I think we can safely dispense with the idea that wearing rings makes you invulnerable to all kinds of death, because for one thing, Gandalf, who started out as an immortal Maya, and also wore the ring Narya, which is a much mightier ring than the Nine Rings, he could still be killed by the Balrog. He was resurrected and didn't really truly die in a sense, but nobody truly dies because everybody's spirit either goes to Montos or something to that effect in Tolkien's world. So nobody just completely dies. And even the Witch King doesn't completely die. You get the idea that his spirit just is reduced to impotence and goes back to Barad-dûr. But so when Tolkien says in the novel, that a person who wears the ring doesn't die but gains more life, he's not talking about can't be killed. He just means they don't die of age, because he's specifically talking about the fact that you just kind of continue on like Gollum. And does anybody really think that Gollum couldn't have been killed, or that, any of the other, wearers of the rings couldn't have been killed? And I don't think that makes any sense. So I think we can dispense with the idea that it's impossible to kill somebody except with spells just because they've worn a ring of power for a length of time. So I just want to get that out of the way. Another general consideration is, if the only kind of sword that would actually be seriously dangerous to the ring wraiths, and the Witch King in particular, is this particular kind of blade, then you would think he wouldn't really worry too much about fighting anyone. You would also think that Gandalf would probably know that and, not wonder whether he could be overmatched by the Witch King, because if he couldn't possibly kill the Witch King with his non-Númenórean sword, because he's wielding an elven sword that was created much, much earlier, then why would he say it might be so? He's leaving open the possibility that he could actually defeat the Witch King. Now, maybe he's leaving open the possibility he could defeat him without killing him. I'm not sure what that would look like. But you do get the idea that the Witch King is at least not totally invulnerable. And there's nothing in the novel that says he's invulnerable. There's nothing that implies that he cannot be killed. So the idea that the blade is what renders him vulnerable to normal weapons and or just being killed generally, I think that's going a step too far. And that I think is just it's putting a little bit too much emphasis on the words about the blade's role that we get 2 pages after the fight itself. What I think is probably more likely the case is that the blade is, for one thing, it dealt him a very bitter wound, to use the words of the novel, in that it certainly would have caused him more anguish in some sense. Physical pain, maybe, at least some kind of psychological anguish, because it's like, his long dead enemies are coming back to to hurt him again, and that's not pleasant. And at any rate, the sword, was destroyed in the result because it vanished. And Aragorn even tells Frodo and the other hobbits earlier on, all blades perish that touch that dreadful king. So all blades, regardless of their origin, if they hit him, are going to wither away. That's what happens to Merry's blade. And he says that about all blades, not just these. So, I mean, there's no distinction there. So the line does say that it breaks the spell that knit his sinews to his will. Does that mean, and this gets into a little bit of the metaphysics of how the rings work, and it's not really 100% clear, because you fade over time if you wear the ring, does that mean that your body is now not only invisible, but somehow not really even controllable, other than to the extent that the ring binds your spirit to the unseen body? That's a possibility raised by the words. So it could be that when Merry stabs him in the back of the leg, when he falls down, he's falling down not just because of pain, but literally because his body is no longer within his own control, because that's really more what the words imply. So it's a really weird little thing there that we don't have a solid explanation for, but I think maybe the more appropriate analysis of how this works is when he gets stabbed by it, he's not being rendered vulnerable, because it doesn't say that's what happens. It's not that he's been somehow made different in any other way than what the words say, which is his his muscles, his sinews are no longer subject to his will. What exactly does that mean? Not exactly clear, because we don't really know exactly how being a wraith works. So I think probably the best answer is just to leave the words as they are and say that to the extent that Merry's blade had a role, it rendered him not vulnerable so much, but not in control of himself. Now, does that mean Sauron, who held the 9 rings, might have still been able to control his body if he had just, directed his own will, but the Witch King would have basically just been a spirit inhabiting a body it couldn't control? Again, who knows? It's not really made clear. But I don't think there's any solid evidence that the blade is the reason that Eowyn could kill him. I don't think that's really implied anywhere. Now, if you know of any evidence out there that I haven't covered, that I haven't really found myself, then let me know in the comments. But I think based on the evidence that I've been able to uncover, it's not that clear. And like I said, I mean, there's the statement by Gandalf in the early draft of the Fellowship of the Ring. You could take that one way or the other because it was cut. Did he cut it because he didn't want that to be the case, or did he cut it just because he didn't want to say it, but he still had that same idea? You can't really know for sure, because nobody's in J.R.R. Tolkien's mind. So none of it is 100% clear, but I think given what we know for sure, the best explanation is something that very literally taking the words at as they are and basically saying probably it just hurt him really bad and in some way affected his own control over his non-living, non-dead, invisible body. So, and the other thing that I think goes along with that is the fact that, again, the Witch King does pause whenever Eowyn reveals she's a woman, and the prophecy is never stated with man being a capital M. Now, Merry coming along and being a part of that certainly is a kind of a dual fulfillment. It's like he doesn't fall by the hands of man. Eowyn, who is not a male, kills him, and she's aided by a hobbit, not a man. So there's kind of like a double thing going on there, which I think is Tolkien being intentionally clever. But the fact that the prophecy is always lowercase m, either, like I said earlier, he's deliberately leaving it as ambiguous as he could possibly do, or he really is directing it to the fact that Eowyn, being a woman, is the real reason for his death. Now, that doesn't rule out, of course, the fact that Merry could have made that possible in some sense, because he didn't die because of what Merry did. So, again, that doesn't rule it out, but I do think there is evidence enough on that side of the scale to say that probably Merry is not the main reason why he became possible to kill. I think it was otherwise. Why would even the Witch King worry about Eowyn? Eowyn clearly is not wielding a sword made by the descendants of Numenor. Eowyn is wearing Rohirrim armor. She's one of the Rohirrim. She's using a sword built by the Rohirrim. I mean, it just seems like why would he worry if that was the case? He'd look at her and go, "Ha, you don't have a Numenorian blade. You can't even hurt me." So all those things taken together, I think that Merry's blade isn't quite as important as a lot of people have taken it to be, and I'll go ahead and just leave it there. So that's my take on a topic which has engendered some interesting discussion on the internet, and I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to learn more about Tolkien's worlds, Tolkien himself, anything Middle-earth related or otherwise, please do subscribe to the channel. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, share it around. You can also follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.